In 1937, Americans desperately wanted to believe that the Great Depression was finally over. Despite lingering unemployment, there were hopeful signs. Stock prices were up and profits were rising.
Oh, baby, what I couldn't do with plenty of money and you.
This is One Man's Family.
The most popular radio shows of the day depicted a world free of Depression's hardships.
One Man's Family is dedicated to the mothers and fathers of the younger generation and to their bewildering offspring.
One man's family, the ideal bourgeois family that we would have loved to have been. I think we all had a character in there that we related to very strongly. It was a family, a very rich San Francisco family, and there was Father Barber and Mother Barber. It represented everything that we didn't have, that we weren't. It represented an ideal, a dream.
In 1937, the American dream of prosperity and security for all seemed within reach. Nowhere did that dream appear more possible than in the American West. There, New Deal projects had helped bring recovery and the promise of a better future.
A lot of worthwhile things were done. Bridges were built, and buildings were built, and roads were built, and it was a time of expansion.
Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. Roll on, Columbia, roll on.
On the Columbia River in Oregon, one of the largest New Deal projects was nearing completion. Bonneville Dam was designed to bring power to the homes and factories of the Pacific Northwest and develop the economy of the region.
It represented hope not merely for an immediate job, although that was very important because they were paying skilled carpenters 50 cents an hour, but it represented the prospect of electrifying the whole Northwest.
Forest Grove homes get enough extra Bonneville power to wash and iron all the family clothes, keep the rugs and drapes spick and span, cook the breakfast waffles, an electric home with more leisure and better living.
On a Western tour, President Franklin Roosevelt stopped to dedicate the $45 million dam.
I cannot help the thought that instead of spending, as some nations do, half their national income in piling up armaments and more armaments for purposes of war, we in America are wiser in using our wealth on projects like this, which will give us more wealth, better living, and greater happiness for our children.
Even as Roosevelt celebrated America's accomplishments, he was aware that projects like Bonneville had come at a high price. Critics attacked him for running the government deeply into debt. In 1937, with the economy showing signs of recovery, the president saw his chance to reduce the debt by cutting federal spending.
FDR was paring the budget, paring relief, paring works programs, all of the things that were essential parts of the New Deal, because he was afraid that he would be hung up politically by his opposition on having spent so much money.
Protesters marched in New York and Washington when the president cut employment in half on his largest work relief program, the Works Progress Administration.
The WPA had made a lot of cuts, and those who weren't on WPA had no jobs. They became jobless again. And they faced that problem of making enough money to pay their rent.
There was always the cloud that you might be laid off. And there were always rumors that next week or next month there would be cuts. And you'd never know if it would be you or not.
Millions of Americans once again had no money. Throughout the autumn, sales in manufacturing dropped. On October 19th, 8 years after the crash of 1929, the stock market crashed again. The economy began a precipitous downward slide. Reporters and political opponents called this new decline the Roosevelt recession. The economy fell faster than in 1929.
Within a few months, it was back into the same level of depression, practically, that it was when FDR took office, as if nothing had been done.
We were very poor, and we didn't experience the Depression being over at all in 1937. It was still a time of great hardship for our family.
By early 1938, close to 20% of all workers were unemployed. Many Americans were once more near starvation. A Nazi newspaper in Germany reported that the American democracy could not feed its people.
We thought there'd never be any change. You know, it had been for almost 10 years of depression, and it seemed to get worse every year.
I remember just moving all the time. We moved. He's a little child. I remember we'd load up and load what we had up, like the tent, or sometimes it was a mattress or whatever we had, and we load that up.
Going any further into California, boys. Too tough down there. There's too many people out of work. And the Relief Administration won't do anything for you.
Isn't this a free country?
You're violating the laws by coming in here. Vagrancy laws. Laws of being on these train property.
During the Depression, more than half the states had laws to keep out the unemployed. In California, police closed the border for 6 weeks.
So they'd stop at the state line and ask them how much money do they have. Well, very few of them had anything much. And if they didn't have $10, they said, well, you can't come in California.
For a time, some people thought if we just met these people at the border and convinced them that California was not the place to come, they'd turn back. But that wasn't a very practical solution.
Public outcry had ended the border blockade, but efforts to exclude poor migrants continued. As the Roosevelt recession deepened in 1938, Californians blamed the newcomers for taking their jobs.
Cars were lined up at the border. These guys were accompanied by two or three big burly officers. And they would look in your car and says, you won't work. How many's in your family? We were held up 4 days right there before they let us pass over.
In one situation that I recall, the Board of Supervisors of the upper county sent a note to the supervisors in the lower county that if these people, these migratory people, try to cross the border, they'll be met with shotguns.
The local people really didn't welcome you because you weren't a taxpayer. Looking back, now I understand it, but I didn't understand it as a child.
People had to go into town. They were broke. They were hungry. They tried to find work. And we've had the police to escort us out the edge of town. Says we don't want you in this town. And a lot of the people in the businesses called us filthy scum, dirty, rotten, stinking Okies.
The arrogance of the established people who were well off in California in trying to exclude these people was no different from the racial bigotry that victimized people who were not, within the majority group.
California had a long history of discrimination. It was illegal for Japanese immigrants to own land. Filipino, Chinese, and Mexican immigrants also faced discrimination from those who feared they would take jobs away from whites.
You had the native sons and daughters of the Golden West, the American Legion. These were groups of people who really owned and ran cities and communities and areas up and down California. And I think their ability to, influence the legislature to pass laws that restricted the opportunities for people who were not of Caucasian descent. That was the order of the day.
I worked in your orchards of peaches and prunes, slept on the ground in the light of your moon. On the edge of your city you've seen us, and then we come with the dust and we go with the wind.
Photographer Dorothea Lange was hired by the federal government to document and publicize the plight of the rural poor. On assignment in California, Lange passed a roadside camp of more than 1,000 homeless men, women, and children. She stopped to take a photograph that would become one of the best-known images of the Depression era.
I didn't want to stop. Almost without realizing what I was doing, I made a U-turn on the empty highway. I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother. She said that they'd been living on vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her and seemed to know that my picture might help her, so she helped me. There was a sort of equality about it.
My mother was a strong lady, a very proud lady. She believed in you work for what you get. You're not going to get something for nothing. And always be honest. And she loved us children very much.
I always consider my mom very, very strong. Looking at her in the pictures, a lot of times she doesn't look like a beautiful woman, but she really was. She was a very strong lady, and we really relied on that.
Within days of Lange's visit, published photos of the 32-year-old widow, Florence Thompson, triggered immediate federal food aid to the hungry migrants and called national attention to conditions in California's agricultural valleys.
I visited one of the first labor camps there at Bakersfield, and I heard some stories about the little children working in the fields. And I remember Bob Flaherty, the famous documentary film man, told me of a scene he had shot the day before. He says it was a girl in her sleep, about 7 years old, and she was moving her hands like this. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, she's dreaming she's picking peas.
In Washington, Roosevelt was still struggling with the disastrous recession and was undecided about how to improve conditions for the nation's poor. In early 1938, unemployment continued to rise and the stock market again dropped sharply. The president could postpone action no longer. He proposed an emergency spending program of $5 billion, an amount equal to more than half of that year's federal budget.
In recommending this program, I am thinking about democracy.
Democracy has disappeared in several other great nations, not because the people of those nations disliked democracy, but because they had grown tired of unemployment and insecurity.
Europe was very much on the president's mind. Just weeks before, Americans had watched Hitler's troops march into Austria.
News of the world, filmed by Movie Tone.
at the peril of war. What will come next? Czechoslovakia?
6 months later, Hitler addressed the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. He threatened to use military force to end what he called the oppression of the Sudeten Germans living in Czechoslovakia.
We began to have broadcasts of Hitler, his crazy, wild rantings. It was very frightening, very confusing to me at that age.
We remained glued to the radio. I had a friend over in Oakland. He's a physician. Every night we'd go someplace and turn on the radio in his car, and we'd listen to what was happening over in Europe.
On the brink of war, France and England undertook urgent negotiations with Germany and Italy. In late September 1938, the four countries signed the Munich Pact. After promising he had no further territorial demands in Europe, Hitler gained control of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Cheers for Chamberlain. Cheers for his pact.
Prime Minister Chamberlain told the world he had achieved peace for our time, and Americans wanted to believe him. In that winter of 1939, Americans awaited the opening of two World's Fairs focused on peace.
Of a new day.
In New York, a 1,200-acre garbage dump in Queens was turned into what promoters called the world of tomorrow.
Tell the wolf at the door that we don't want him round anymore. Better times here to stay as we live and laugh the American way. Listen one.
Fair organizers promoted a future in which American know-how ended the Depression.
Hail the dawn of a new day.
Talk or blow, you'll see your voice projected on the screen.
Tell me, Jim, do you honestly believe that industry can make enough jobs in the future to take care of the young people that are coming along?
I think the problem is going to be the other way around. Industry will make so many jobs, there won't be enough people to fill them.
1, 2, 3. She's splashing so hard it's getting all over me, and it's a little dangerous to attempt to give a blow-by-blow account of what's going on in that dishpan. That water in the pan is an awful messy-looking sight, folks. I wish you could see it. Too late. There's the last drop of water, folks. The contest is over in exactly 7 minutes and 58 seconds. In that time, Mrs. Modern has washed 50 dishes and 40 pieces of silverware. Well, it's all over, Mrs. Drudge. You may as well rest now.
On the West Coast, New Deal funds had built an island in the San Francisco Bay to house the Golden Gate International Exposition. Opening day drew 130,000 people to Treasure Island.
It's my universe, even with my empty purse, 'cause I've got a pocket full of dreams.
The fair didn't open until 9. But the Bay Bridge was filled with cars, and they were blocked up, so they hurriedly sent word to us, and we opened early, then about almost an hour, and the cars just flowed through, and the ferry boats were just filled with people because they could come over from San Francisco for a dime.
President Roosevelt opened the San Francisco Fair by radio.
The maintenance of peace in the Western Hemisphere must be the first concern of all Americans. By setting an example of international solidarity, we may keep faith alive in the heart of anxious and troubled humanity.
The pavilions of 26 nations welcomed visitors.
pavilion that we kind of enjoyed was the French pavilion, and we enjoyed going there to eat lunch, and especially the waitresses. They wore these real petite outfits, and the fellas all used to enjoy that.
Oh, the fair was wonderful. It was just a lot of fun. Kind of got you away from the depression. I didn't go as many times as I wanted to because I didn't have the money. I mean, the fair was in 1939, which to me was the height of the Depression.
My older brother Eddie and I saved our money, and we took the ferry from Vallejo to Treasure Island. And it was a magic place. Saw myself on television for the first time. That was to be the world of
With unemployment in California still close to 14%, the exposition had lost more than $4 million by the end of its first season.
I didn't go to the San Francisco Fair. We couldn't afford it. And I remember being very much aware that the fair was there and being very unhappy that I couldn't go. And my younger sister couldn't go. So, no, there was some bitterness about not being able to go to the fair.
In the world beyond Treasure Island, more than 9 million Americans were still unemployed. One survey showed that each month some 6,000 poor migrants came to California in search of work. In the spring of 1939, John Steinbeck's best-selling novel, The Grapes of Wrath, followed the journey of the Joad family from Oklahoma to California. A year later, a movie based on the novel was a box office hit.
I remember when The Grapes of Wrath, the movie came out, and we went to the movie together. And I remember the hooting done by the audience. And we were so indignant, so terribly indignant over that, because these were farmers' kids, ranchers' kids, and they were not deprived, and so they were making fun of the Joad family, and I think we felt a real kinship with the Joad family.
Sure don't look none too prosperous. Can we go somewhere else?
Want a gallon of gas?
The Grapes of Wrath opened in the midst of a national debate about what, if anything, should be done for the real-life Joads searching for work in California. Federal camps for migrant workers housed a small percentage of those in need. Eleanor Roosevelt spent 5 days on a fact-finding tour of the camps. When she returned to Washington, she presented her findings to a congressional committee.
The people, all of them, young and old, are deteriorating in health. Nobody gets proper care for the eyes or the teeth, or malnutrition, bad nutrition, lack of change of diet, that sort of thing, has a permanent effect on all the people, and particularly on the children.
After a decade of economic crisis, it seemed that America had become bored with the poor. Many were beginning to accept high unemployment as a continuing fact of American life. On September 1st, 1939, war news interrupted the beginning of America's Labor Day weekend.
Adolf Hitler's all-out attack on Poland makes the long-dreaded European war a certainty.
In violation of Hitler's personal guarantees, Germany had invaded Poland. Appeasement had failed. 2 days later, France and England declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or to close his conscience. I hope the United States will keep out of this war as long as it remains within my power to prevent. There will be no blackout of peace in the United States.
Throughout the spring of 1940, news reports told of Hitler's advance across Europe. His troops overran Denmark in a matter of hours, Norway in a few weeks, Holland in 5 days, and Belgium in 18. Americans learned a new German word, blitzkrieg. It meant lightning war.
The Nazis are marching ahead at the fastest speed a conquering army has moved in all history. All roads in France are choked with...
Good evening, everybody. Tonight, it seems clearly apparent that the first great phase of the war in the West has been won by Germany.
For the first time, America started to wake up to realize that they had to face dictatorships, not only in Germany, but in Italy and in Japan, that might threaten to take over the rest of the world, and would we be next?
When the San Francisco Fair reopened for its second season, Hitler's armies were pushing through the valley of the Somme toward Paris.
You could tell that things were going to change. One by one, the big pavilions that was open from Europe closed. The French, the Swedish, the European pavilions closed because of the war.
We had a lot of people that were employed that were refugees from the countries that were being overrun. Their parents were in the center of the turmoil. They didn't know of how they were going to make out and things like that.
In Asia, Japan's aggression kept pace with Germany's. By 1940, invading Japanese troops controlled the coastal areas and major cities of China. Reports of Japan's brutality toward Chinese civilians hardened anti-Japanese sentiment in America.
At the time, my boyfriend was in the Merchant Marine, and he told me about how the United States was selling scrap metal to Japan. He said it's going to come back as bombs.
I think there was a great deal of anxiety that, my God, what's going to happen if and when the war comes? We were being attacked in the mainstream media with people who were writing about the yellow peril, the threat to the safety of the Republic. We were not Japanese Americans, we just simply were Japanese.
In May 1940, the Nazis began bombing British cities. Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent a letter to Roosevelt warning of a Nazified Europe if England did not get assistance.
This is London. Screaming bombs were dropped as well as fire bombs on the London area.
A month later, France fell. U.S. military experts predicted the defeat of Great Britain. Anxious British parents sent their children to the United States for safety.
Hello, London. Some of those youngsters you sent over want to talk to you.
We're all in fine sun and fine fettle.
Good. And no bombs?
Oh, we have them every day. That's nothing.
Well, thumbs up will always be in England.
Somewhere in there, it was becoming more and more what could be termed, I guess, a people's war, a war in which people had a stake, a war in which it was really between democracy with all its faults and fascism, which was total repression.
I don't think the president believed that the Nazis would invade the U.S., but he was worried about the destruction of Great Britain, about the destruction of the Western world and everything it stood for.
Roosevelt's efforts to aid Great Britain met with strong opposition. World War I had ended just 20 years earlier. Americans still haunted by that war opposed involvement in another European conflict.
People really thought that it was possible not to go. It wasn't just tiny little sections of people who felt that way. There was a dominant feeling that against going into the war.
Where is freedom if 4/5 of a nation can be carried to war against its will?
The aviator and American hero Charles Lindbergh was a leader in the isolationist movement. He and the more than 250,000 other members of the America First Committee believed that staying out of the European war was the only way to preserve American democracy.
It is now obvious that England is losing the war, and I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send.
It was a difficult time for the president, and of course the president had to say there will not be any foreign wars. But he interpreted this to mean this is not a foreign war for us. This is a war for the survival of democracy or the democracies. And we are involved.
On September 3rd, Roosevelt announced a plan to provide England with 50 destroyers. Isolationists called it an act of war. 2 weeks later, the president signed a bill authorizing the nation's first peacetime military draft. 14 million men registered on the first day. With the nation still struggling with high unemployment, the draft provided much-needed work. Among the new recruits, 40% were rejected for poor health, a legacy of a decade of hard times. As war engulfed Europe and Asia at the end of September 1940, the Golden Gate International Exposition closed its doors for the last time.
One of the writers said that he took the last ferry boat back when they were turning out the lights, and he said that we were no longer young. Our youth had vanished with the closing of those lights.
Well, when I think of Treasure Island, I think that it was the last perfect time of my life.
5 months later, workers began converting Treasure Island into a naval base. In the fall of 1940, as the nation edged toward war, Roosevelt was re-elected to an unprecedented third term. Americans had chosen a proven leader for the uncertain times ahead.
Never before, since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, has our American civilization been in such danger as now. The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
That night, telegrams supporting the president flooded the White House. 3 months later, Congress authorized $7 billion in military aid to England. As war industries tooled up, Americans began to go back to work. Thousands of poor migrants in California found jobs.
It changed, you might say, overnight. They just all took off.
Either they went into the military or the shipyard or the aircraft factories.
I'd come out of the field working for 20 cents an hour, and the union wage was 86 cents an hour for labor. I was in tall cotton then, boy. That's more money I ever saw in my life.
It was hard getting jobs in shipyards and the growing airplane industry. The only jobs you could get was just as common labor. If you had skills, like if you were a plumber or an electrician or something, they wouldn't give you a job. Unemployment picture was very bad among blacks, far worse than it was for whites. 40% of the blacks were unemployed.
A federal government survey found that more than half of all defense jobs were closed to blacks. The labor leader A. Philip Randolph believed the new infusion of government funds meant the president could take action on job discrimination. In a call for action, he wrote, "We are fighting for the right to work, for the right to live. Let the Negro masses march forward, preaching the gospel of justice, freedom, and democracy."
I think the whole strategy on Randolph's and the other leaders' part was to impress the president and the nation that we had some power.
Randolph threatened to lead 100,000 black men and women in a march on Washington unless the president acted.
I think the very thought of blacks marching on Pennsylvania Avenue frightened FDR a little bit, because there are all sorts of things might have happened, you know. It could have gotten out of hand. There could have been riots on the streets. I think that's what Roosevelt was looking at. And he didn't want that to happen, and we were supposed to be the capital of democracy.
His worry was that the other groups would perhaps interfere. There'd be bickering along the parade line and so forth on. That's what he was afraid of.
Despite several requests from the president, Randolph refused to cancel. Just 6 days before the scheduled march, it was the president who gave in. Roosevelt issued an executive order banning discrimination in defense industries. The first presidential order on behalf of equal rights since Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation.
I think FDR acted with great political courage at the time, although you look back upon it and it seems a rather meager and obvious step. But he was still hidebound by the dominance of the Southern Democrats in the senior positions in committees in Congress.
In exchange for Roosevelt's executive order, Randolph called off the march.
We felt it was a new day coming. That's what we thought. Although deep within ourselves we knew we still had a long ways to go yet. But this was a victory we achieved at this time, and then people started getting jobs. That's the most important thing.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
I was riding up to the Columbia River toward the dam at about 11:30, and they broke into the symphony announcement that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. That night, we mobilized our staff, and we all went out with shotguns and rifles to guard the transmission line crossings, because we were afraid the Japanese would try to blow them up to disrupt the power to the aluminum companies and the chemical companies that were vital to our war effort.
General Watson came out. He says, Mr. President, they got the whole goddamn Navy. What in the hell are we going to do now? The president was, he was in a heavel. He had his head in his hand, and he was saying, oh, my God, how did it happen? How did it happen?
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
We never turned a radio on, so we knew nothing about it until there was a knock on the door, and our neighbor, Mrs. Bowman, had run over in great distress, and she just yelled, "The Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor." Well, our hearts went through our boots because my brother was supposed to be in Pearl Harbor. And then the reports came that they'd bombed everything there, and the 5 ships were sunk, and it got worse and worse and worse.
The first thing that hit me was the newspaper. It says Pearl Harbor bombed, and Jap bombers bombed Pearl Harbor. And I had the funniest feeling all of a sudden. I felt like everybody and their uncle was looking at me. So I hurried home, and when I got to Japantown, the place looked as though it was deserted. I could see extra police cars in the area, and suddenly I began to see FBI agents, and had a completely different feeling all of a sudden. I suddenly felt insecure.
I remember being approached by 2 gentlemen from the Federal Bureau of Investigation who said they had a presidential warrant for my arrest, and I must come along with them. As well, I want to call my lawyer. No time for that. I want to call my wife. She was 9 months pregnant. I was in for 11 days and nights. My wife thought I was dead.
America was at war on 2 fronts. 3 days after the Japanese attack, Germany and Italy had declared war on the United States. In the tense atmosphere that followed, authorities viewed Japanese Americans in California as a security risk. Many of the most prominent were arrested immediately. 2 months after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signed an executive order authorizing the evacuation of all persons of Japanese descent from the now vulnerable areas of the Pacific coast. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, 2/3 of them American citizens, were taken to government relocation camps.
You can't understand it unless you lived through it. Now it seems like a dreadful thing to do. But we didn't know. I mean, all of a sudden this attack had come. We didn't know. It was obvious that somebody was telling them where the warships were.
Well, I wrote editorials about that, and I was indignant. I didn't like it. I felt they did it to the Japanese because they weren't white. And I also mentioned in my editorials that there were a lot of Germans, and Italians here. I said they weren't interning them.
I remember a Japanese-American friend of mine having a farewell party at her house. I remember weeping in saying goodbye, and we were all very sad, but nobody protested. Very few people anywhere protested, and I guess it was because we thought it was important to the war effort or to unity on the home front.
I was at the YMCA in Japantown the day that most of them were evacuated. And here are these people carrying bags, things wrapped up, say, in a blanket. That was all they were taking, what they could carry. And it was a perfectly awful thing to look at. Just perfectly awful.
When I think of what really happened, the destruction of the Japanese community, the destruction of the family relationship, the price that was paid by the Japanese American was very high.
As America went to war, government propaganda posters and films used racial caricatures of the enemy to mobilize the nation.
of industry. Pledge yourselves to victory. Day and night in the cause of right, we will work, work, work till we've won. Side by side for America.
Tanks, we'll keep them rolling. Planes,
We'll keep them flying. Guns, 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 keep them shooting.
give them hell.
California received more defense dollars than any other state.
You could hear about jobs. And people started coming out here from other parts of the country.
California's war industry sent recruiters across the country offering jobs and transportation expenses. With its borders once again open to the unemployed, the state gained nearly 3 million new residents.
I rode the train here, and I sat on my suitcase from Shreveport to California because they had 2 coaches for colored people, as they call them. And when it got to Shreveport, they were filled. So I sat on my suitcase all the way for 3 days to get to Marin City.
We had people from all over the country, from all walks of life. We had people who couldn't read, people who never earned any money before. They just flocked in.
One of the welders on the team, he was Chinese. There was another one who was Spanish-speaking. It was a little United Nations, that crew of welders.
With the military drawing men to war, nearly 5 million women joined the labor force for the first time.
The men just seemed to be totally surprised, totally outraged. Their mouths dropped open, they dropped their tools, and we just, partly because we were embarrassed and partly because we didn't know how to respond, we just kept our nose to the grindstone and did our work.
I definitely grew, and I felt a stronger person, a stronger female, a stronger black woman. And that...
It was tremendously important to have a decent wage. And it meant that my father and mother could buy a little house. And this was the first time in their lives they had been property owners.
In 1943, with the federal government spending more on defense than it had ever spent on relief or public works, America finally reached full employment. Roosevelt announced that Dr. New Deal had become Dr. Win the War. The Great Depression, which had held 1/3 of a nation in poverty for more than a decade, was over. Roosevelt's New Deal had changed the country, but it was the war that brought prosperity to a generation of Americans. They were our parents and our grandparents, our aunts and uncles. They had endured the hardest of hard times and triumphed over adversity.
Being aware of the political upheaval during the 30s and struggles of our family made me aware that people don't gain anything without struggle.
It laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement in the 60s. I think it did. I think blacks were moving in that direction already.
One thing that the experience of the Depression taught the American people was that when they came together around common problems, they could get something. Together, they could accomplish something.
During World War II, America outproduced the world. Henry Ford's Willow Run aircraft factory near Detroit was turning out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. In California's shipyards, Liberty ships were being launched at the rate of 2 per day.
You get a sense of accomplishment because you can see before your eyes what you have done. And when a ship is welded, all of these various components are sewn together, so to speak, so that the complete hull is just one big piece of steel.
Then would come that most exciting moment of all, when they launched it. And there would be the usual ceremonies and the fancy ladies with their hats and the bottle of champagne and all of that kind of stuff.